For 20 years, my cousin was the golden boy and I was the family joke. But when he stood up at the reunion to take legal control of my grandfather's estate, he made a fatal calculation. He thought I was emotional. He didn't know I had spent 3 weeks with a forensic accountant. For 15 years, I watched my cousin Jake collect family admiration like other people collect participation trophies, except his were real and mine were pity laughs at Thanksgiving dinner. Every family gathering followed the same script. Haki would walk in and within minutes someone would ask about his latest achievement while I'd get the sympathetic head tilt and the question about whether I was still at that job. The job they asked about I'd quit 3 years ago, but nobody bothered to remember because in their story I was stuck in the same chapter while Jake got sequel after sequel. My Aunt Carol kept a dedicated photo wall in her hallway, Jake's graduation picture spanning from kindergarten to his Ivy League MBA, and tucked in the corner was my high school photo from 2008, still wearing that awkward smile and cheaper frame. He stopped correcting people around year 7. When Uncle Rob asked if I was still doing that computer stuff, I'd just nod and let him pivot back to Jake's promotion at the family investment firm. My mom tried to defend me once, mentioned I'd gotten a raise, and the table went quiet for exactly 4 seconds before my aunt pivoted to Jake's engagement to Amanda, who apparently came from old money and volunteered at 3 charities. He learned something valuable in those 15 years of being the punchline. When nobody's watching, you're free to build something real without the pressure of their expectations crushing it before it takes shape. The golden boy dynamic didn't start maliciously, which somehow made it worse because there was no villain to blame, just a slow accretion of family narrative that hardened into fact. Jake was 3 years older, which meant he hit milestones first and set the standard I'd apparently never reach. When he made varsity soccer as a freshman, I made JV as a junior and got the athletics on for everyone speech from Grandpa. When Jake got into Cornell, I got into state and heard about how state was actually better for finding yourself and staying grounded, which was code for low expectations. The thing about being compared to a golden child is that eventually you internalize the comparison and start making it yourself. I'd catch myself thinking Jake wouldn't have messed that up when I stumbled through a presentation, or Jake probably knew the right wine to order when I froze at business dinners. Family reunions became performance reviews I never passed. Haki would show up with stories about corporate retreats in Aspen and I'd mention my studio apartment like it was an achievement just to have separate bedroom. My dad, to his credit, never played favorites, but he also never shut down the comparisons, just gave me that sad supportive look that somehow felt worse than the jokes. By my late 20s, I'd accepted my role as the family's cautionary tale, the reason parents told their kids that passion wasn't enough without direction, proof that not everyone gets a happy ending. Being the family joke teaches you which laughs are with you and which are at you, and at reunion number 12 I finally understood that none of them had ever been with me. It was July 2019, at my aunt and uncle's lake house, the annual summer gathering where extended family flew in to drink expensive wine and compare children. I'd brought my then girlfriend Sarah, thinking a +1 might shift the dynamic, but within an hour my cousin's wife had absorbed her into conversations about wedding planning and I was back in my usual corner with the kids, table refugees. Jake announced his promotion to VP that afternoon, 29 years old and already executive leadership, and my uncle literally opened champagne on the back deck while people toasted his vision and work ethic. Later that night I overheard my aunt telling someone that she worried about me, that I seemed lost, that some people just took longer to find their path while others were born knowing it. Sarah broke up with me 2 weeks later, said I became a different person around my family, smaller somehow, and she wasn't wrong. I'd spent so long contorting myself into their low expectations that I'd forgotten I was capable of standing up straight. That breakup hit different than the others because her parting words stuck. She said I'd built this entire identity around being the disappointment, that I walked into family events already defeated, and maybe if I stopped showing up to lose I might actually find out who I was. The invitation for the 2023 reunion came in March, cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering because my Aunt Carol did everything like it might be featured in a lifestyle magazine. Annual family reunion, Lake House, July 14th to 16th, dress code smart casual, please RSVP by May 1st so we can arrange accommodations. He stared at it for 3 days on my kitchen counter, that familiar dread building in my chest like water before a dam breaks. My first instinct was the same as the previous 2 years, ignore it and send a last-minute excuse about work commitments or a summer cold. But something had changed in the 4 years since Sarah's breakup, something I'd been building quietly in the margins of my life while my family's narrative about me stayed frozen in 2015. I'd started a digital consulting business in 2020, initially just freelance work to supplement my income, but it had grown into something real. 15 clients, retainer agreements, revenue that eclipsed my old salary, and the kind of work-life balance I'd only heard about in LinkedIn thought leadership posts. The difference was I hadn't told anyone in my family. Not out of spite, but because I'd learned that their opinion of me was fixed and facts wouldn't change it, so why bother providing updates to people who weren't actually listening? But sitting there looking at that invitation, I wondered what would happen if I showed up not to prove anything, but just to exist as the person I'd become when they weren't watching. He called my therapist, which sounds dramatic, but Dr. Martinez had been helping me untangle family dynamics since the Sarah breakup made me realize I was living someone else's story about me. I told her about the invitation, about my instinct to skip it, about the petty part of me that wanted to show up and somehow make them see I wasn't the failure they'd decided I was. She let me spiral for about 10 minutes before asking the question that reframed everything. She said, what if you went for you, not for them? What if you attended with zero expectation of changing their minds and just practiced being yourself in their presence? It sounded simple, but it cracked something open in my chest. For 15 years I'd been showing up trying to manage their perception, either by hiding or by desperately offering evidence of my worth that they'd ignore anyway. What if I just showed up as myself, answered questions honestly, maintained boundaries, and let them think whatever they wanted? Dr. Martinez called it radical acceptance, not of their narrative, but of my inability to control it. She suggested I document my goals for the weekend, not outcomes I couldn't control like make them respect me, but internal measures like stay calm when and asks about my job, don't compare myself to Jake, leave if I'm genuinely uncomfortable. I left that session feeling something unfamiliar, not excitement exactly, but the absence of dread, a neutral curiosity about what might happen if I stopped playing the role they'd written for me. The preparation for this reunion looked different than any before it. I didn't buy new clothes to impress anyone or rehearse answers to justify my life choices. Instead, I organized my thoughts and my documentation, a habit I developed running my business that turned out to be useful for family dynamics too. I made a list of my actual accomplishments since the last reunion, not to brag but to ground myself in reality when the comparison started. Grew business to 6 figures annual revenue, published 3 articles in industry magazines, helped 12 clients scale their digital presence, moved to a better apartment, ran a half marathon, maintained friendships, went to therapy. On paper my life looked objectively good, but I knew that wouldn't matter because family narratives aren't based on evidence, they're based on mythology established years ago. I also did something Dr. Martinez suggested that felt awkward at first. He went through old family texts and emails, not to build a case against anyone, but to see the patterns clearly. Uncle Rob had asked about my job status 17 times in 4 years and never once followed up on my answers. My aunt had sent Jake congratulations messages for promotions, closed deals, anniversary, but my birthday texts were generic. The documentation wasn't about keeping score, it was about seeing objectively that their disinterest was about them, not about my worth, and that gap of understanding became strangely liberating. He told exactly 3 people I was attending the reunion, my best friend Marcus who'd heard every family drama story for a decade, my business partner Lisa who needed to know I'd be offline that weekend, and my mom who sounded genuinely surprised I was coming. Marcus asked if I was sure, knew how these events typically went, and I appreciated that he didn't bullshit me with optimism. I told him about Dr. Martinez's approach, about going for myself with zero expectations, and he made me promise to text him if I needed an exit strategy. Lisa, who'd never met my family, asked why I was nervous about a reunion, and I realized I'd never fully explained the golden child dynamic because outside that family context it sounded almost silly. But when I described it, the constant comparisons, the 15 years of being the cautionary tale, she got quiet and then said something that stuck with me. She said, the person you're describing, the family fuck-up who can't get his life together, that's not the person who built a successful business and shows up prepared to every client meeting, so which version is actually real? It was a good question. I'd spent so long code switching between competent professional and family disappointment that I'd never considered just being one consistent person and letting them deal with the cognitive dissonance. The drive to the lake house took 4 hours, windows down, playlist alternating between confidence-boosting classics and calm instrumental music because I was trying to regulate my nervous system before arrival. They rented a hotel room 15 minutes away instead of staying at the house, a boundary Dr. Martinez and I had discussed that gave me control over my exits and mornings. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway, I saw the familiar scene already in progress. Jake's Tesla in the prime parking spot, my uncle manning the grill, kids running around the lawn, that particular brand of relaxed wealth on display that my family performed effortlessly. I parked my reliable but unimpressive sedan at the end of the drive, took 3 deep breaths, and reminded myself of the only goal that mattered, stay true to myself regardless of their reactions. Walking toward the deck, my Aunt Carol spotted me first and her face did that thing where surprise and mild disappointment flicker before the social smile locks in. She called out that I'd made it, her tone suggesting she'd expected me to bail, and suddenly I was in it, the reunion underway, no turning back, just the opportunity to be myself in a context that had never allowed it before. I could do this, I thought. I could just be myself for 48 hours and survive whatever came next. The first 3 hours followed the familiar script with such precision it almost felt like comfort, the devil you know versus the one you don't. My aunt hugged me with that fragile politeness reserved for distant relatives, asked about my drive, then immediately pivoted to help Jake's fiancée Amanda with something in the kitchen before I could answer. Uncle Rob handed me a beer, said good to see me, heard I was still doing that computer work, and walked away before I could clarify that I run a consulting business not IT support. My younger cousins, teenagers now, gave me the awkward waves of people who'd been told I existed but had no real relationship with me. He found my designated spot on the deck periphery, the place where unimportant relatives stand holding drinks and watching the main characters interact at center stage. Hackey was holding court near the grill, talking about a deal his firm just closed, something about commercial real estate and international investors, and I watched my family lean in like he was revealing prophecy. The old version of me would have felt that familiar shame creep up, would have started the internal comparison spiral, but I'd prepared for this. I pulled out my phone and texted Marcus, holding steady, "They're exactly as expected," and his response made me smile. "Remember, you're playing a different game now. They're playing status and you're playing authenticity." Dinner was served buffet-style on the long table overlooking the lake, the summer sun doing that golden hour thing that made everything look like a lifestyle ad. He filled my plate and intentionally sat with my younger cousins instead of fighting for relevance at the adults' table, a choice that immediately felt right. My cousin Emma, 17 and apparently dealing with college application stress, asked what I did and I gave her the honest 30-second version. I run a digital consulting business helping companies build their online presence, work from home mostly, good income and flexible schedule. She asked how I got into it and I told her the truth. I started freelancing on the side while working a job I hated, slowly built a client base, took the leap in 2020 when my job went remote anyway, and figured it out as I went. Her eyes lit up in a way that surprised me, said that sounded way better than the corporate track her parents were pushing, and suddenly her friend group at the table was asking real questions. What skills did I need? Was it scary going solo? Did I regret not doing the traditional path? For maybe the first time at a family event, I was having a genuine conversation about my actual life, not performing or defending, just talking. Across the deck I caught my mom watching with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between surprise and relief, and I wondered if she'd been waiting for me to stop shrinking around these people too. What I didn't expect was Amanda approaching me an hour later while I stood at the dock watching the sunset. She'd been friendly but distant all day, playing her role as the golden boy's perfect fiancée, so her seeking me out felt noteworthy. She stood next to me in silence for a moment before asking if I was close with Jake growing up, and I gave her the diplomatic answer, not really, different ages and different lives. She nodded like that confirmed something, then said something that cracked the evening open. She said Jake had been stressed lately, that the promotion came with crushing expectations, that he worked 70-hour weeks and barely slept, and she'd noticed I seemed genuinely happy in a way he wasn't and wondered what that was like. I didn't know how to respond at first because it felt like a trap or a test, but her face held genuine curiosity, so I gave her the honest version. I told her I'd spent years chasing a version of success that looked like Jake's, trying to win approval from people whose respect seemed always just out of reach, and it made me miserable. So I stopped chasing their definition and built a life that actually fit me, smaller maybe by their standards, but mine. She went quiet, stared out at the water, then said she wished Jake could hear that, and I realized the golden child carried weight I'd never considered, the pressure of maintaining that shine. That conversation with Amanda shifted something in how I moved through the rest of the evening. I wasn't invisible anymore, or rather I stopped trying to be visible in the way I'd previously attempted and just existed as myself. When my aunt asked later if I was still doing that computer thing, I corrected her clearly but without defensiveness. Actually, I run a digital consulting business, 15 clients, been doing it full-time for 3 years now. She blinked like she was recalibrating, said oh that's nice, and moved on, but the difference was I'd stated my reality and didn't need her validation of it. My uncle overheard and actually asked a follow-up question, what kind of companies, and I told him about my client base, the revenue models, the shift to digital-first strategies most businesses were navigating. He listened with what seemed like genuine interest before saying that sounded solid and asking if I had a card, his firm might need that kind of expertise. It was a small moment, 30 seconds of actual conversation, but it cracked the narrative just slightly. Later that night as people drifted toward bedrooms and I headed to my car to drive to the hotel, my mom caught me on the driveway. She hugged me longer than usual and said I seemed different, more settled somehow, and she was glad I came. He told her I was glad too, and I meant it. Day 2 of the reunion started with breakfast on the deck, bagels and coffee and that particular morning energy of people who've had too much wine the night before. He arrived at 9 after a solid sleep in my hotel room, a luxury I wouldn't have had staying at the house, and immediately noticed the shift in how people acknowledged me. My younger cousin saved me a seat, Emma asking follow-up questions about remote work and client management. My uncle brought me coffee without being asked, mentioned he'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to connect me with his marketing director. Even my aunt seemed slightly more present, asked where I was living now, and actually listened to the answer instead of performing interest. Haki was quieter than usual, scrolling his phone with the tense energy of someone dealing with work crisis on vacation, and I felt unexpected empathy. The golden child doesn't get days off from being golden. Around 11, my uncle suggested the traditional family photo, the annual lineup that would go on social media and Christmas cards, and for the first time I didn't position myself at the edge trying to disappear. I stood where I was told, smiled genuinely, and didn't analyze my place in the frame because I'd stopped letting their arrangement of me define my worth. The crack in Jake's composure came early afternoon during what should have been a casual volleyball game on the lawn. Teams were uneven, competition was light, but Jake played like it was an Olympic qualifier, diving for saves and snapping at teammates who missed shots. When his fiancée Amanda laughed at a bad serve, he turned on her with surprising sharpness, said if she wasn't going to take it seriously maybe she should sit out. The lawn went awkward silent, that collective holding of breath when someone crosses a line publicly. Amanda's face flushed and she walked toward the house without responding, and Jake stood there breathing hard, suddenly aware everyone was staring. My aunt tried to smooth it over, said everyone was getting too competitive, maybe time for a break, but the tension hung there. I watched Jake's face cycle through anger to embarrassment to something that looked like exhaustion, and instead of the satisfaction I might have expected from his public stumble, I just felt sad for him. The pressure of being perfect was crushing him and nobody in the family could acknowledge it because they needed him to be the golden child, their proof that the family produced excellence. I walked over, asked if he wanted to grab a beer and walk the trails, and his surprise was obvious, but he nodded. We walked in silence for the first 10 minutes, the trail winding through pine trees away from the house and its performing. Finally Jake spoke, apologized for the scene, said work had been insane and he was taking it out on people who didn't deserve it. He told him I got it, pressure makes people sharp, and left space for him to say more or not. He surprised me by continuing, said the promotion everyone celebrated last night came with expectations he wasn't sure he could meet, that his boss expected him to bring in 20 million in new acquisitions next quarter and he had no idea how. He said sometimes he looked at me and wondered what it was like to just do work you enjoyed without the weight of everyone's expectations, and I almost laughed at the irony. I told him the truth, that I'd spent 15 years thinking he had everything I wanted, the family's pride and respect and attention, and only recently realized that came with a price I wouldn't want to pay. We sat on a fallen log overlooking the lake and had maybe the first honest conversation of our lives. He asked about my business, actually asked, and I told him about the flexibility, the creative problem-solving, the satisfaction of building something myself. He said that sounded incredible and admitted he'd never considered anything outside the family firm because that's what was expected. He asked if he wanted to be doing what he was doing and he went quiet for a long time before saying he didn't know anymore. We walked back to the house 45 minutes later, and something had shifted between us, not friendship exactly but a recognition of shared humanity beyond the roles we'd been assigned. Jake found Amanda and apologized publicly, not a performance but genuine acknowledgement, and she softened. The rest of the afternoon had a different energy, less performance, more actual presence. My dad, who'd been mostly quiet all weekend, pulled me aside and said he'd noticed how I'd handled myself, calm and confident, and he was proud of who I'd become. It was the first time I could remember him saying that without qualifications or comparisons, and it hit harder than I expected. I told him I'd figured some things out the hard way, and he nodded like he understood more than he was saying. That evening instead of the formal dinner, people made their own plates and sat in organic groupings, and I ended up in a long conversation with my uncle and two cousins about the future of work, remote culture, and the skills that actually mattered in 2023. They listened, asked questions, treated me like I had expertise worth hearing, and I realized this was what I'd wanted for 15 years but had stopped needing somewhere along the way. The drive home felt different than any family event departure before it. Usually I'd spend 4 hours replaying awkward moments and nursing resentment, but instead I felt something close to peace. I hadn't won anyone over dramatically, hadn't delivered some movie moment speech that changed hearts and minds, hadn't knocked Jake off his pedestal. None of that happened because none of that was the point. What happened was simpler and more important. I'd shown up as myself, maintained boundaries, engaged honestly when people were ready to meet me there, and released attachment to changing minds that weren't open. So many people saw me differently, some didn't, and both outcomes were okay because my worth wasn't on trial. Dr. Martinez had been right that the goal wasn't to fix the family narrative but to stop letting it define me, and for 48 hours I practiced that successfully. I called Marcus from the road, gave him the full download, and he said I sounded different, lighter maybe, like I'd put down weight I'd been carrying. He wasn't wrong. For 15 years I'd carried the family's story about me, the disappointment, the cautionary tale, the one who didn't measure up, and somewhere that weekend I'd set it down and walked away from it. 3 months later, I got a call from Jake that surprised me. It was in my city for work, wanted to grab dinner if I was available, and I agreed more out of curiosity than anything else. Over Thai food in a loud restaurant, he told me he'd been thinking a lot about our trail conversation, about what he actually wanted versus what was expected. He said he'd started seeing a therapist, was working on setting boundaries at the firm, had real conversations with Amanda about what kind of life they wanted to build together. He thanked me for not gloating when he cracked at the reunion, said he'd expected judgment but I'd offered humanity instead, and it stuck with him. I told him I'd learned the hard way that the family's narratives about us were stories they needed, not truths we had to live, and he could write a different story anytime he wanted. He asked how I'd done it, stepped outside their expectations, and I gave him the honest answer. I stopped showing up for their approval and started building for my own satisfaction, and eventually the gap between their story and my reality became too obvious to ignore. He said he didn't know if he could leave the family firm, too many entanglements, but maybe he could redefine success on his own terms within it, and I told him that was enough. Small shifts in the right direction compounded over time. A year after that reunion, I got the invitation for the next one and didn't feel the familiar dread. I RSVP'd yes without overthinking it, blocked off the weekend, and made plans that included boundaries and self-care. The event itself was remarkably unremarkable in the best way. People asked about my business with genuine interest, I had real conversations with family members who'd previously treated me as background, and Jake seemed noticeably calmer, more present, less performance. Mayan still centered attention on achievements and status. Some people never change, but I didn't need her to. My younger cousins treated me like the cool older relative who'd figured out an alternative path, and I leaned into that role. There was no dramatic reversal, no moment where the family apologized for 15 years of dismissal, no movie ending. Used the slow shift in dynamics that came from me changing how I showed up and some people being capable of meeting that change. The ones who weren't, who still needed me to be the cautionary tale to make sense of their worldview, I let them have that story. It didn't touch me anymore. I'd built a life I was proud of, relationships that were reciprocal, work that mattered to me, and a sense of self that wasn't dependent on their validation. The golden boy could keep his spotlight. I'd found something better in the margins they'd never bothered to look at, the freedom to define success for myself. Sometimes, the real victory is not letting yourself lose, even if the other person wins with a lie. If you've ever felt something like this, please let me know in the comments. I read every comment. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Don't forget to share it with someone close to you, they might need to hear it too. And if you want to hear more such real stories, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.